Now, ever since we heard from an anonymous source inside of Lucasfilm that Rey is their biggest and best asset, and that they're essentially planning on doubling down on her going forward, that she will be featured in multiple projects in the coming years, there are those who have been wondering if, or even writing articles saying, that this could have a sort of Clone Wars effect on her or for the sequels. That much like how the Clone Wars supposedly turned people around when it came to the prequels, how it made some who initially didn't like those films come to appreciate them, that projects featuring Rey in the post-sequel trilogy era could sort of do the same thing for the sequels, that it could shine a new light on those films, or bring people around to them where they start to appreciate them when they maybe initially hadn't, that it could even turn some of the haters into sequel lovers. And though, well, anything is possible, I suppose, and before going on, I will say that, sure, whatever Rey projects Lucasfilm puts out in the coming years, assuming any at all, and I say that mainly because of their recent track record of announcing projects that never do come to fruition, but assuming this is all true and they go ahead with the plan, and these films or shows or whatever they end up being, they start to come out and they do indeed feature Rey, yeah, there is certainly a chance they could be good. Though how many people are willing to give them that chance who didn't like the sequels on the whole, that is the real question here. I mean, if you are someone who really did not like the sequels, who think they killed Star Wars, or at the very least killed your love for it, are you really going to go and see another Rey movie to spend your hard-earned money to see the symbol of the death of Star Wars, in your opinion? Just like, and shifting back to the Clone Wars now, and for the record, I am a big fan of the show. I'm not here trying to tear it down with this video or anything I'm going to say in it. I'm just going to try to keep it real, as they say. But if you hated the prequels back in the day, if you're one of those people who think they ruined your childhood or were just bad movies in general, were you really going to see the Clone Wars movie in the theater and or going to watch the subsequent series on Cartoon Network? Were you really going to see a movie or show set literally during those films you hated? Were you ever going to watch them, no matter what people might say about the Clone Wars, if you were someone who really did not like the prequels? The same way people who hated the sequels today probably wouldn't get all that excited about, say, an animated series set during the sequels either, and yes, one did exist for the record. Star Wars Resistance, the forgotten show as I think of it as, since virtually no one ever talks about it today, but it was set during the sequel's time period and even kind of overlapped with the films a bit. But anyway, speaking of actually going to see a movie with Rey, when we look at the Clone Wars movie, how that did at the box office, well, it actually did pretty well in some respects. It made a little over $68 million worldwide. It only cost around $8 million to make, which is, that's a nice little profit. That's also, you could argue, not a bad number for the first ever Star Wars animated feature film. But yeah, when compared to other Star Wars films or compared to the prequels, which the series again supposedly helped out, the Clone Wars supposedly saved the prequels, well, it falls well short of, say, the $868 million Revenge of the Sith made roughly 3 years prior at the worldwide box office. In other words, as I was saying, if you didn't like the prequels, there's a really good chance you skipped the Clone Wars movie and also skipped the series, even though the ratings on Cartoon Network were initially quite good, or quite good for the first few seasons anyway, with it generally getting a few million viewers during that first couple seasons, per episode I mean. And actually, the very first episode was the highest rated premiere in the history of Cartoon Network, or at least it was at the time. I'm not sure if that has changed. Though, despite that very successful beginning, as the series went on, as the seasons went on, and even though I would personally argue the show continually got better and better, with the later seasons being some of the best Star Wars you're going to find anywhere, but even though I'd argue the show only got better and better with time, the viewership numbers did not. They actually continued to go down, were basically cut in half from earlier seasons and the later ones, and Cartoon Network was going to cancel the show if George Lucas himself didn't put up the money and keep it going. And I mean put up his own money, not even taking from Lucasfilm, but taking it directly out of his pocket to keep the show alive because he personally loved it that much. And as someone who watched it as it was initially releasing or as the seasons were going on, and yeah, this is a personal anecdote, so take it for what it is, but I don't recall it being really all that big or popular with the fans. Yes, there were those who certainly loved it at the time, but I don't recall it really making a huge splash, if you will, or tons of people talking about it across social media all the time. Though, yes, social media was obviously still kind of in its infancy, you could say. It had not grown and evolved into what it is today. This is roughly 15 years ago we're talking about, so who knows the reception the Clone Wars would get today if it were coming out now. Either way, what I do remember back then is, well, honestly, I remember people complaining about it quite a bit, especially fellow EU fans that were really, really unhappy how it was contradicting or retconning things from the EU version of the Clone Wars, which I certainly understand because, it is pretty much incompatible with the Dark Horse comic books at the time, or with the Karen Traviss novels that came out. The series is even apparently the reason she stopped working for Lucasfilm or writing Star Wars books. That everything she had established in her books, mainly about Mandalorians, was completely wiped away by the series. And again, from what I remember, I don't recall there being a big wave of positivity towards the Clone Wars series until it hit Netflix. That seemed to just change everything overnight for whatever reason. Maybe because it allowed people to just sit down and binge the show. They didn't have to wait week to week anymore. If you watched a maybe not so good episode, you just went on to the next one and forgot about how bad that previous one might have been. And yeah, there were weaker episodes of the Clone Wars, especially in the first two seasons. The first two seasons are not horrible, but they're not the greatest television ever. And though I do think there is absolutely truth to the idea that the Clone Wars animated series made the prequels better. I mean, they do. The Clone Wars gives much, much more context to the prequels because it does have the time to do that. It also gives us the actual Clone Wars that the films really didn't. I mean, we barely see any of the Clone Wars in the films. We see the very beginning and the very end. It also allows for some great character development, especially for the clones themselves. They are, in many ways, the star of the show. But also between Obi-Wan and Anakin, we actually see them being brothers, if you will, which we don't really get too much of in the films. They're mainly at odds with each other in Attack of the Clones, and then it is the end in Revenge of the Sith, obviously. There's also great new characters, like Ahsoka, but she is just one of many, as well as plenty of interesting lore to sink your teeth into, even regarding the Force itself. There are a lot of things to love about the Clone Wars, and yeah, they just make the prequels better because they had the time and the ability to do so. However, despite that being a very popular narrative today that the Clone Wars make the prequels better, or even save the prequels, some will say, I'm not so sure that's being said by people who initially didn't like the prequels, but is instead just being said by people who initially did like those movies, or from those who discovered Star Wars through the Clone Wars. A lot of younger fans who were kids when that series began and came to love the prequels almost by default, since the show they fell in love with is integrated into those films. And so, yeah, I think a lot of fans did love the prequels from the very start, and those who didn't love them have probably long since left the fandom and long since stopped complaining about them. And the show gave those fans who did love the prequels all the more reason to love them. There's always this belief that the majority of fans, or just people in general, hated the prequels. And without question, yeah, some people did. There are plenty of people or fans out there who didn't like the prequels. I'm not arguing against that. And I even argued that very point when I said how few people, relatively speaking, went to see the Clone Wars movie. But I think that belief that there is this vast majority of fans who rejected the prequels, that it comes mainly from the media at the time, who, back in the early 2000s and before social media really became popular, they completely controlled the narrative around those films and convinced, well, pretty much all of us that everybody hated those except for a select few. They always pitched this idea that the prequels were bad, in large part because there's not a lot of love for George Lucas in Hollywood. He has always been a bit of an outsider or rebel who doesn't like to play by their rules, and thus they don't tend to say nice things about him. And so, to wrap it up here, yes, the Clone Wars effect is real. It did make the prequels better, you could certainly argue or make a case for. But I really don't think if you're someone who didn't like the prequels that you ever gave them the chance. You probably just fell out of the fandom, essentially. And I really don't think if you're someone who now doesn't like the sequels that you're ever going to give Rey another chance, much less do a 180 on your feelings towards the movies she first appears in, those of course being the sequels. I think, much like Clone Wars did, if these new Rey projects are good, they could attract in new fans, new younger fans who may go back and become sequel fans, kind of by default, and that those who hate the sequels will just continue to fully hate the sequels and leave the fandom or stop caring. They'll stop complaining about them because they have moved on. We are already seeing far less hate towards the sequels these days, and that is only going to fade more and more away, and make some believe that people are coming around to them when they're just not complaining anymore. Much like those who didn't like the prequels back in the day, again, have long since moved on and never even watched the Clone Wars in the first place. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it is your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about this one. Do you think the Rey movies could save the sequels? Could they change opinions about them? And do you think the Clone Wars really did that for the prequels? Are there a lot of prequel haters or original prequel haters that came around because of that series? Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.